So good morning. My name is Hugh Forrest. I am the Chief Programming Officer of South by Southwest, and it's a great honor to be here this morning. I personally have been at South by Southwest far too long. I started working in 1989 at South by Southwest. That was 2 years after it started. Like the city itself, the event has changed a ton over those 30 years, but the main focus and the core of the event is still the same, and that is a focus on creativity, an event that helps creative people achieve their goals. I mention that because I think that as we go forward in this AI future, humans' ability to be massively creative is more and more important than ever. As much as AI is the focus of the last 2 days here at Fair Market, AI is also a big part of South by Southwest over the last few years. Almost all our sessions that focus on AI in some way have been very crowded. I will say that those sessions kind of break down half and half, some being very optimistic about the AI future, some being less so. At South by Southwest, we also do a lot of things gaming. For 2019, the South by Southwest Gaming Expo runs Friday, March 15th through Sunday, March 18th. This giant playground happens at the Austin Convention Center. It is free to attend if you have a badge. If you just want to buy a ticket to the Gaming Expo, it's much cheaper. For this morning, I am very excited and honored to be in conversation with the legendary Richard Garriott. From his official bio, Richard Garriott is a founding father of the video game industry and the commercial spaceflight industry, a flown astronaut and an accomplished explorer. He has been inducted into the Computer Gaming Hall of Fame and has received the Industry Lifetime Achievement Award. He is credited with creating the now ubiquitous term avatar for one's virtual self and the category of massively multiplayer games, otherwise known as MMORPGs. As a principal shaper of the commercial spaceflight industry, he co-founded Space Adventures, the only company to arrange space flights for private citizens, and is the 6th private astronaut to live aboard the International Space Station. From my less official version of that paragraph, Richard is one of my all-time favorite people in Austin, and one of the folks whose ever-inquisitive personality gives this place its very special and unique flavor. I'm not saying this simply because he was the first keynote speaker at what was then called South by Southwest Multimedia way back in 1994. Yes, he was. No, I'm saying this because his huge range of interests and expertise, from video games to space travel, to medieval culture, to personal transportation systems, to a variety of other next-generation entrepreneurial pursuits, embodies what it means to keep Austin weird. Please join me in welcoming Richard Garriott to the stage.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. Before we sit down for a chat, I wanted to show a few slides to kind of talk about how far video games have come to get to the place. We'll have a little bit of chat as to where we are now and kind of what the future holds. You already heard my introduction, but before I even got started in games, it's interesting that AI and computer games goes way back. All the way back in the 40s, people were already creating fairly simple circuits to play games like NIM, and also in my research, I actually even found out this is a modern version of this antique one that I bought on eBay for myself. But you can actually do, there are games that are doing mechanical AI that came out in about the 1950s and 60s. And so with literally just a simple set of 4 or 5 little gates, you can begin to create AI for games that can even be done mechanically. And by the way, Amir, this one's for you. But I got my start typing in code, simple code for simple AI games like this game Hunt the Wumpus, where a monster would only move, frankly, randomly. So the first AI was pretty simple. I got my start in the 70s on machines that were still using core memory to store the programs, and the AIs for my earliest games were the creatures would literally just sort of magnetically attract towards the player. Even when my games a few years later started going 3D, the AI was not much more sophisticated, really just sort of attracting towards the player. But in the 80s, we began to see it pick up a little bit. It began to put in conversations to where you could talk to the characters in the game about ask them their name, ask them what they did for, as a job, ask them about the game environment around them, and began to have very simple but fairly compelling interactive conversations. A few years later, AIs began to have schedules where they go to sleep at night, wake up in the day, go to a job, sneak out in the middle of the night, and do something dastardly to the player. It became a little bit more sophisticated. Even if you jump up to the game I'm working on right now, there are not only do the characters in the game have these quite elaborate conversation systems and scheduling systems, it's still fundamentally done in a fairly old-fashioned way. It's really gigantic state machines more than a true artificial intelligence, at least in my games, and that's something we can talk about as to why that has remained the case. But if you look, also, people, I think of all of you who are interested in AI, I'm sure have seen how, whether it's a combination of neural networks or the genetic algorithms, and combine that with a lot of analysis of previously played games, whether it's chess or Jeopardy or Go, those champions have now fallen to AIs. But there's a different thing that comes up when you look at some of the AIs that are being driven into the gaming environment right now. And so, for example, a lot of my competitors or compatriots in my industry are now really taking AI seriously, and developing AIs to play in these much more open-ended games requires another level of sophistication. These AIs have become extremely good, but have also shown the limitations of what some of those AIs are. In particular, we won't watch this long enough to see it, but in this particular example, as good as the AIs got, they still get caught running in circles, chasing each other, kind of stuck in a pattern, which kind of showcases the fact that they don't have a next level up of general AI on top of them watching their behavior. Even just this year, just in the last few months, this very popular session-based game called Dota 2, AI bots were trained, very rapidly to play this game. It beat all the amateurs. They can beat almost all the professionals. But very importantly, in the grand, championships, which literally were only September, so just 2 months ago, in the World Championships, humans still won. And if you go talk to the players as to why they believe that is true, they would say that while the AIs have become extremely efficient at reacting to whatever is happening, they don't go into it with a master plan. They're reactionary versus having sort of a second-order intelligence on top of them developing strategy. And I think that's an important thing for the next step of AI in games. For those of you who watch the gaming industry, you can see that we do use this a lot. We use AI a lot in other areas of procedurally generated terrain to paint the landscapes and forests and grass. AI can do a great job of augmenting the developer. The same thing with doing analytics on the player experience, data mining for user behavior so you can improve the actual fun factors of the game, and alternative approaches to the characters in the game. I mentioned how my games were still kind of stuck in these state machines. There are companies now, like this one group called the Spirit Character Engine, that are trying to actually solve that. I actually don't know personally how well they've solved it, but there are at least people tackling it. But then fundamentally, I go, where is this all going? The games are often thought of as, ultimately approaching, the Matrix or, some other true virtual reality or the Oasis, to use the Ready Player One analogy. But I think those things really are ultimately where we're headed with games. But I think that we still have a big gulf, before we get there. So on to the conversation.
Excellent, Richard. Thank you for the slides. Those are very, very helpful. So it strikes me we're a 2-day conference on AI with lots of incredible programming, and as far as I can tell or know, and Amir, correct me if I'm wrong, you're the first person to talk about video games. Why is video gaming, computer gaming important in this context of AI? How does it provide a test case, test use atmosphere?
Well, one of the things I've found interesting about both the discussions I've heard this morning as well as from yesterday is it's very obvious that AI has found its rhythm, found its great opportunities now to solve any problem that you can cast into a formula. You can say that there is a resolvable mathematics, and AI will do that far better in many cases than a human might taking on a similar problem. What games provide is a much broader context, a more challenging context, but one that is also that plays out quickly. One of the things we found in games is that if we set the taxation rate in a game up or down, the player base reacts to it very quickly, and the efficiencies, the players min-max the fastest rise to success in a game environment very quickly. And so unleashing AIs into a massively multiplayer type experience lets you very quickly sort out whether they're working or not, and the challenge is so much greater than it is for non-game environments that I think it's going to really help us develop general AI more quickly.
One of the points that you mentioned in the slides, which I think is fascinating, is that idea of when humans are pitted against the AI gaming, that the humans, correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying have the most success when they are the most unpredictable, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, in fact, the first of the two video clips I was showing, if you watch that on the internet through fruition, you'll see that an AI unleashed against other AIs or on its own into an environment to learn things like go pick up supplies, go get yourself healed up, protect the flag, kill off some opponents or defeat the opponents and capture the other flag. That's still reducible to a fairly simple set of functions, you might say. And so neural networks and genetic algorithms can very quickly become seeming masters of that. However, they sort of fail on two areas. Well, in fact, they mentioned one other thing they do very well, which is if you put a team together of human opponents, each human has their own individual ego. And so one of the ways AIs really beat humans is they are completely happy to sacrifice one for the good of the many. And humans, by their very nature, have a self-preservation instinct. And so no human wants to be the sacrificial lamb. And the AI obviously doesn't care. And so it's interesting that that's one of the ways that shows up that AIs can dominate a lot of players is through that dispassionate approach. On the other hand, because humans can consciously rise one level above the simulation, they can then use that, they can exploit that to develop strategies, that lack of forethought on the part of the AIs.
And as someone who I think plays games a lot, have you played against an AI, and are you able to detect that this is a very different experience than playing against another human?
Well, so what's interesting is for me as a player, I'm beatable by most other players, much less other AIs. But I can tell you the moments of time where I became, in awe of the state of change of AI. I mean, for me, one was playing the first version of a now long-running series called Medal of Honor. And I remember being up in a castle or a fortification and taking out a jeep full of invaders. And when the jeep blew up and rolled over, I thought, phew, I saved myself. And then 4 or 5 of them crawled out of the jeep and began to make their way through the rubble, continuing up to get me. And I realized, oh my gosh, this simulation is levels beyond what previous games had done. However, as impressed as I was with that, that was still not yet the kind of AIs that you're seeing here for these industrial AIs. These were not algorithms, either genetic or neural networks, that were doing a large-scale data analytics to find the optimal path. These were still fundamentally driven by a human conceiving of state machines to make those happen. These neural network-driven ones, I've seen as long ago as 20 years or so being developed here at UT. That were already playing some of these first-person shooters, already showing this promise. But even then, you could see some of these odd weaknesses of AIs getting caught running in circles, around a target because they didn't have the skills to turn sharp enough, or frankly just recognize that they were stuck in a loop.
Interesting. You talk about UT 20 years ago, and what's interesting about Austin is we have this very strong AI community. We also have a very strong gaming community. In your experience, are those two communities engaged with each other, or are they relatively segregated?
Well, I would say 20 years ago they were oddly segregated, and it wasn't for lack of trying. I actually think that the research that in particular I saw being particularly active at UT, they were actually quite interested in engaging with the game industry, as the game industry was quite interested in taking advantage of the work that was being done in the AI, this AI work. But I would say that until the last 3 to 5 years, maybe a little longer, but that order of magnitude, the direct applications seemed a bit long. And that's actually why, even though I only showed one brief slide about this company that is creating a larger overlay for character-driven AI, which in my mind, that one of the real challenges for writing story-based games is you sort of need this combination of a human in the development loop, in developing challenges for players, in addition to what AI can do very well, which is the modeling of a natural world, the modeling of a natural reaction.
Interesting. Again, to this context of 20 years ago and what UT was doing, if you can think back to Richard Garriott from 20 years ago, is this where you saw the gaming industry going in 2018, 2019, or are you surprised with where we are now? Did you think it would be farther along or less far along?
Well, that's interesting because at least for me, my perspective has I've both overshot and then alternatively undershot pretty dramatically. In my the earliest parts of my career, I didn't know this was going to, become an industry at all, much less how far it might go. But there are other areas in addition to AI, like for example, virtual reality, where I've been a VR fan since the day on an Apple II I could put on these little goggles and see tiny little chiclet-sized screens in front of your eye with terrible latency, terrible resolution, and made you sick almost immediately. And that VR to become commonplace has always been about a decade away, and I still think it's about a decade away, and I've said that pretty much my whole career. And AI has had sort of a similar track. In the 80s, when I first started writing characters that had a conversation and a schedule, to me that was opening the door to having true AI characters in the game. Characters that would sit there and think about, am I hungry? I better go eat. That they, like a real human, have this complex array of motivations that bubble to the top to decide what they ought to be doing on a moment-to-moment basis. And what I discovered over the years is that a simulation, in the context of a game, simulating that is very easy by giving people sort of a schedule. Get up in the morning, go to your shop, go to the restaurant, go out and work, and then putting some variability into that schedule based upon literally the alignment of the stars in my games drive a lot of the movements of some of the characters around. The player immediately the player can't tell the difference. The player doesn't know if that character went there because they were hungry or because it was this complex schedule, because you're not in the mind of the character. Every time we've tried to simulate the general purpose AI, which most recently on my game Shroud of the Avatar, which just came out this year, we created conversations that had this. I'll describe sort of the sophistication that went into them. the writer that would write a character would give them keywords and knowledge that they would have specific to that individual NPC. They could then also pull in pools of knowledge that were general to the people in their community. They could also pull another pool of knowledge from people of their profession. They could pull another pool of knowledge from people with their faction of interests. And there was an arbitrary number of these additional pools that could be pulled in. And then on top of that, we made it to where if people were talking to our NPCs and asked them about things that they didn't know, that we would record that, so our writers could then go back and say, oh, people are always trying to proposition somebody over here for some way. Let's come up with a clever response to that, or at least not make them sound stupid. And what we found is that is a really, really hard problem. And while companies like Amazon with Alexa are trying to solve that directly head on, that is many, many millions of dollars of investment to come up with that kind of general purpose answer. And so to me, it sort of described this gulf that we still are trying to solve, at least in the gaming industry. But I predict there will be soon this pivot where suddenly we're going to get over that hurdle.
You talked about Amazon. You talked about some of these other companies showed them in your slides. Who from your peers do you think is doing the most interesting, the most fascinating, the most forward-thinking work in terms of integrating next generation AI into video games?
So I'd answer that by breaking it up into kind of two parts. I find video games are in many ways trapped in their own success in the following sense. Moore's law is moving so fast, and the abilities you can put into the bells and whistles, which often include AI, into a game, make it to where it already costs hundreds of millions of dollars to make a AAA game now, and 5 years of development, and that's just to make basically a really beautiful, really clever first-person shooter. No narrative, or at least not much narrative, just bells and whistles and run around and fight things and find that a very visceral, compelling experience. And so almost everyone in the industry is kind of caught up in that race. And so, by the way, for uses of AI, that's also where you're going to see the most interesting and compelling uses is in direct opponents that will, whether cheating or not, provide you, the most compelling resistance or opponent as you go through the experience. For me, as an artist, I like the storytelling aspects of games. I actually want the game to be meaningful to me as a human. I want to face something that is more of a emotional, philosophical, experience. I want to be challenged to my own base thinking in humanity, much like a good book or a good movie will do with you. Well, it turns out the games industry doesn't reward that nearly as well as just keep making the bells and whistles, because again, the bells and whistles are so hard. But every now and then, so what I find is there's stability in the games industry where there's not a new piece of hardware like a CD-ROM or a hard drive or the internet or 3D hardware or some breakthrough on AI. Every time that happens, there's a reset back to first-person shooter. Whenever there's stability in the platform, things get deeper. In other words, if somebody's already made a great first-person shooter on a particular platform, to compete with that, you need to make a deeper experience. And in my mind, that becomes more interesting. But that also is really hard, because then you're going into character motivation, and you want an NPC that has not just this keyword response algorithm, but something deeper, something where it's doing a psychological motivation of at least you, the player opponent, and responding to you, the player opponent, in a way that is customized to how can I seduce you into believing that to staying off the straight and narrow course of goodness, and turn you to the dark side, so to speak, and challenging you to do that is again what this kind of next order AI I think will do. And I think you're seeing not necessarily all the people going for first-person shooters. Most of them aren't paying attention to that yet. But those of us that are trying to deepen the art, I think, are really focused on that particular problem.
Excellent. I think we've got time for one more question, and this is a little more from a thought perspective. We know that a lot of the general understanding or misunderstanding of new technology, such as AI, comes from books and movies and other pop culture references. We have the movie War Games from the 1980s, but are there more recent examples of movies, books, stories that you think provide a particularly compelling vision of how AI and gaming may coexist in the future?
Yeah, fascinating problem, I think. Again, if you look at the full pantheon, I guess, the first AI I remember, in this case, portrayed negatively, would have been HAL on 2001. There's another old movie called Demon Seed. I gave a copy to Amir that I want to see if he's watched yet. Also about how an AI developer who was married to a woman that made robotic arms. This AI used that mechanical arm to do something bad. More recently, you've seen movies more more sophisticated or more nuanced things like the movie Her, which I'm a particular fan of. And every time I talk to people involved in the AI, you always hear the opposite perspectives of Elon or others who might think that it will clearly be our doom, and a lot of people working in the field would argue that no, we understand what's going on under the hood better than outsiders might, so don't fear it. I'm pretty agnostic. I actually think that AI is going to be mighty powerful. I think once we get to the point of general AI, which is sort of needed for a lot of the applications we're trying to create, that we are going to have a little bit of the genie out of the box issue to deal with.
Excellent. I think we're out of time. Richard, thank you so much for joining me on stage. Please give Richard Garriott a big, big hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh.